Hello, everyone. I am Takeo Hoshi, Professor of Economics at the University of Tokyo and specially appointed professor at Tokyo College. We are happy to have as our lecturer today, Professor Nobuhiro Kiyotaki of Princeton University, who is currently at Tokyo College as a guest professor. Before inviting Professor Kiyotaki to speak, I would like to say a few words about Tokyo College. Tokyo College was established about 3.5 years ago at the University of Tokyo to provide a place for researchers to think about various aspects of the future society together with the public. We gather researchers from various academic fields, especially young researchers, to conduct research activities, and we also hold webinars and other events to think together with the citizens like this. Past webinars can be viewed on YouTube and others, so please add the Tokyo College channel on YouTube to your favorites if you have not done so yet. I would like to thank Professor Tadashi Haneda, Dean of the College, and everyone at the Tokyo College for their support in organizing today's lecture. I would like to take this opportunity to thank them. In particular, I would like to thank many people there for all their help from the planning stage to poster creation and publicity and to support on the ground today. Thank you. Now on to the main topic. The main focus of today's session is of course Dr. Kiyotaki's lecture. I have asked him to speak for about 1 hour. After that, I will come back as a discussant and speak for about 10 minutes. I am sure that you will have many questions to Dr. Kiyotaki. So please use the question and answer function of the webinar tool to post your questions during my discussion. So at this point in time, I would like to ask Professor Kosuke Aoki, who is also a colleague of mine at the Graduate School of Economics, to serve as a facilitator. After getting PhD in economics from Princeton University in 2000 at the beginning of this century, Dr. Aoki has done research and reteaching at the Bank of England, the UK's central bank, and also Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona and LSE, or London School of Economics, before coming to the University of Tokyo in 2011. And currently, he is a professor at the Graduate School of Economics today. In addition, he is a director of SURGI, the Center for International Research on the Japanese economy, affiliated to the Graduate School of Economics. Like Dr. Kiyotaki, Dr. Aoki is also a specialist in macroeconomics and is a world-renowned researcher. And I think it's fair to say that he is one of the leading experts on macroeconomics in Japan. Now I want to hand over to Dr. Aoki and ask him to introduce Dr. Kiyotaki. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I am Aoki. I am with the Graduate School of Economics of the University of Tokyo. I would like to serve as facilitator from this point onward. And as Professor Hoshi said, we are going to have the lecture by Professor Kiyotaki of Princeton University. Professor Kiyotaki made a lot of significant contribution to macroeconomics and theory. First, with Professor Blanchard, Nobu developed a macroeconomic model with monopolistic competition and sticky prices. Their framework is regarded as a foundation of the modern economics or the new Keynesian economics that is widely used by academics as well as policymakers. Furthermore, with Professor Wright, he developed a search theoretic model of money known as Kiyotaki-Wright model. That is a basic fundamental model of money. And furthermore, with Professor John Moore, he investigated how financial markets interact with macroeconomic activities through asset prices and borrowing constraints. So real economy, including employment and the GDP. So the intersection with real economy, how the economy amplifies, has been analyzed. The model is called the Kiyotaki-Moore model. All of his works made a significant contribution to our understanding of macroeconomy and policy, not only for academics, but also policy makers. The significant contribution has been made by Professor Kiyotaki. So this time, today, the agenda of the lecture is Intangibles, Inequality, and Prolonged Stagnation. This is the title of the lecture today. So until 4 p.m., Professor Kiyotaki will speak, followed by Professor Hoshi's comment and Q&A session. Now I hand over to you, Professor Kiyotaki.
Hello, I am Kiyotaki. Thank you for coming to listening to me. Today, I would like to talk about this theme: intangibles, inequality, and stagnation. My slides are written in English, but my oral presentation will be given in Japanese. There are many of you in Japan might think that in the past, Japan used to enjoy a very high economic growth, but lately, growth rate has gone down. And I think you must be interested in this topic. So this is the first slide. It shows real GDP per capita, shown in log. Red line represents Japan, blue, Italy, and the green represents Spain. And as you may know, up until 1970s, Japan was in the area of a high economic growth era, which started in 50s, lasted for 20-year period, during which time the growth rate on per capita basis was exceeding 8% or 9%. However, then came the first oil crisis back in 1974. Ever since, growth rate started to come down. But up until 91, nevertheless, the per capita growth rate still stood at within the range of 3 to 4%. But after 91, on per capita basis, the growth rate became less than 1%. So why is it that the growth rate started to come down since 91? What has been the policy reason which might be involved? And many of the people have discussed this matter. And a similar picture can be found in Italy as well, which is represented in blue. Look at Italy. Italy used to have an Italian miracle with a high economic growth rate, but ever since 1970s, growth rate started to come down, and for the past several decades, the growth rate is hovering around zero. What about Spain? They had a catch-up phase which lasted longer, and for the past 15-year period or so, growth had also stopped in Spain as well. Having said that, we have to think about the reason why this situation had occurred. One thing we can say has to do with intangibles. This is the next slide. Kyoto is not me, different person. Professor Kyoto collected these data sets. RSC on the solid line stands for relative skill content. Within the export, the skill is involved and how much input has been done in terms of the skill as well as non-skill. And it's 1.39 or 1.47. Within the export, you can see the content of the skill involved. which is about 1.4 to 1.5 times more of the exports, which means that in case of Japan, we had a trend of the export having a higher level of skilled level and importing those which have lesser skill level. So Japan had a relative advantage in the export with a higher content of a skill. And this looks at it from a different industry, professionals, management, and engineers. And those are represented as a skilled person. So you can see the proportion of these people. But since the mid-90s, rapidly relative advantage started to wane. Comparative advantage peaking at 94. So Japan's concentrated use of relative skills have started to lose their comparative advantage. What is it that in terms of the skill level, the comparative advantage has started to be lost in Japan? There are reasons. One reason is being that there was a rise of China. But if the China is a reason, then not only about the skill, but in terms of the capital, same thing should have happened as well. So please look at this chart, which shows relative capital content of trade. So there are whether to find out whether Japan had a competitive advantage in the capital input. Look at Japanese exports, inclusive of intermediate goods. In terms of export, when the capital is involved, the capital intensity is very high compared with the imports, about 1.15% larger. Excess capital is used, and the intensive use of capital is used in goods, which stayed constant. With regard to this skill, comparative advantage is being lost, but when it comes to capital, still competitive advantage is held up. This is what we can learn from Professor Kiyota's data. Then comes the next question. What is it that accumulation of skill, it has become stagnant? That is a problem. We have to find out the reason why. One hint is that look at the lifelong employment practice, which have become weaker over the years. Princeton and Ueno-san collected this data in the labor economics field. Look at the orange one from 1970 to 1981, the cohorts. Blue one shows the cohorts who were born from 1944 through 1949. And if you look at the mean tenure of those cohorts, please look at the age 38. The average mean tenure for people born from 1944 through to 1949 is 13 years. At the age of 39, more or less, they started working with the same company since 25 years old. Some of them, of course, started younger with the same company, but if you're talking about the same company, then the mean tenure will be about 13 years. Globally compared, this level is very high. By and by, if you look at younger cohorts, for example, those born during the 1970 to 1981, the mean tenure is 10 years, almost 3 years shorter than the older cohorts. This is for male. What about the female? It's reverse. Younger the cohort, it tends to be that their mean tenure runs longer. Younger generation tends to have a longer mean tenure in case of female. So amongst the female population, long-term employment is increasing. But if you look at the overall picture, the tenure might be different, but in case of a female, they tend to shift toward longer employment as opposed to male. So what we like to think about at this time is in what way, in terms of work, skill can be accumulated and how it will be transferred from one generation to another. We focused on the skill, and we regarded skill in a general way, intangible capital. Ever since 91, during the first part of the 90s, Japan entered into financial crisis era. And because of the impact coming from the financial crisis, for long term, it had resulted in secular stagnation, widened the inequality. We wanted to find the reason why. And look at the households. There are initial conditions like endowment and education. They are different from one individual to another. But why is it that the initial small difference would lead to a large inequality across people over a long number of years? That is what we wanted to address. The essential question is that you can look at the time series data. The small shock can give a greater shock to the entire economy. And the third question is from the individual point of view. Initial condition difference might be very small originally, but it could grow into a big amplification effect later on. So by time series, amplification can be felt for the first question, and the third question is relevant to the individual's perspective. Impact getting larger over the years. We are the theoretician, and we tend to rely on the model. We want to really establish a theory well. Why we address in this manner, in such a complicated way? Because we have to think well about the theory first. Then we can look at to what extent specific phenomena might occur under different conditions. Why is it that results might be different? The reasoning behind that will be made clear if the theory established is correct and proper. That is why we really focused on the building of a correct theory. I will show you the equations later, which will get into a complicated realm. But first, let me just share with you the overview. There are skilled members who can train young workers so that young workers can grow into a future skilled workers. And we are here talking about training, but training takes time, which means that as a company who provides the training and those who receive training is incurred with cost. Because it is costly, but it can yield effective results. So it can be regarded as an investment in intangible capital. However, one of the characteristics about investing in intangible capital is that outcome of training is subject to idiosyncratic shocks that, depending on the individual, it may work out nicely or it may not work that nicely. So how should we think about the firms? Because there are present skilled members as well as future skilled members who will be the future core worker. And the firm is a coalition of present and future skilled members. One can say many things about the firms, but when we say firms, we say that this is a coalition of the present and future skilled members.
こうした訓練はですね、一部はその企業に特有でありますけれども、一部は
Training, some of it might be firm specific, but some of them can be more general. Here we use the term firm specific. Partially firm specific means that there are some general purpose type of skills involved as well that can be applicable to other firms. So young workers enter the labor market for the first time to start with, and they do have a learning capability or endowment from their parents. We call this initial endowment, how much money they have been born with and so forth, and ability, those are being considered. Of course, some of the that have been obtained through the schooling education, but initially, at the time of joining the labor market for the first time by younger workers, we have to be mindful that initial endowment and abilities are heterogeneous. Results might be diverse, of course, and initially it's diverse. Now let's think about it. If individual workers, working population, would choose to stay with one company, can they make a full commitment to it or not? We can think about this. Who would receive the training to what extent? It's totally independent from the initial endowment. It's only dependent on the ability of that person who undergoes training. And there are idiosyncrasies involved as well, individual to individual differences, but they are being distributed rather equally so that remunerations are concerned, they are not dependent on these qualities or elements. So with a full commitment, staying with that company for a long period of time, then the results will be like this. Under this kind of economy, there is no income inequality to be produced. It just depends on the initial ability. This used to be one of the characteristics of a Japanese company. There are managers there as well as workers at the core. And if we talk about wage differences compared with Western countries and the rest of the world countries, the gap is very small in Japan. And sometimes Japanese headquarters, a CEO like Toyota, earnings might be less than the US Toyota's CEO. Not much difference between the managers and the workers in Japan, but it doesn't happen like that in the United States. The gap is much wide. However, there is as for full commitment, those who have obtained a skill, then the workers can find a new job in a new company. So what they lose is the company-specific element of the skill. So whether the training can be received to a certain extent would also depend upon the endowment and learning ability. Rich young workers can receive more intensive training, while poor young workers will not get much intensive training, so they may remain as unskilled workers for life. Skilled members upper limit is very high. Those skilled members can earn hundreds of millions of yen of annual income, which result in wider gap and inequality. If the commitment is weak, in case of Japan, at the end of the 1990s, there has been the mid-career recruitment made intensively, and the spreading of the mid-career employment is not bad, but you had to produce some side effect on the part of the company. In-company training started to be less. Accumulation of intangibles delayed, putting a stop to the improvement of the productivity and also widen the inequality as well. Those are side effects which have been or which might have been experienced. So thus far, I have mentioned to you the overview. Now let me get into more complex area. If you can understand it intuitively, then that's enough. You can look for details in my thesis. Here we talk about overlapping generation. Young ones come one after another, and older ones expire. And a unit measure of agents are born every period and fixed for 2 periods. Based on the premise that population remains constant. But in case of Japan, population can decline. So young people join the labor market. They have two things, kappa, which is a learning ability to learn skill. E means endowment, from their parents. Like the inheritance from the parents. And the individuals have different conditions on that. And there is a X, which is a distribution. I'm talking about learning ability and endowment, which may be unequal, but what is distributed equally is time. So time can be used for working, or the same time can be spent for learning. So economists like us always think about utility function. The current consumption, CYT. This is young people's current consumption. And COT plus 1 means the upcoming consumption during the CT plus 1 next term. And there is a expectation utility, log utility. So there might be some aversion to risk. The most important point about this model or slide is this: how we can look at companies. There's a present and the future skilled members, and the coalition between the two makes up the firm. So if this coalition, present skilled members, tangible asset might be K, then a part of it, KW, will be used for production. And as a result, value added Y will be produced. Intangible capital KW and the L, input of labor, will be the function, increasing function. So young people can be trained to gain skill. This is the portion which is used for training the young people. And kappa is the ability of the young people. And the H proportion of time will be spent for gaining skill. So if H is 1, then all the time will be spent for learning, and 0 means no more things to learn. So what about the trainers? This is the K Chudo and receiver with students' size, efforts, and ability, age and kappa will be involved, and this produces a result. In terms of education, it's always two ways, not the one way. Not only teachers unilaterally teaching, but there should be students to be taught. It takes two to have a education. This is a K plus portion that I'm talking about. In the next term, the skill, intangible capital will be produced, and this is Z shock. Depending on the individual, the K plus is the average, but there is a differences amongst individuals. This is a pie portion. Differences in the obtaining of the skill. Average is one, but individuals have a wide range of difference. Last point here is that if the person moves to other company, then theta portion will be lost. Skilled personnel, if K plus Z will be the accumulated skill if one stays with the same company, but if the company changes, then 1 minus theta portion will be the reduced skill part when working for another company, moving from the original company. So this is specific to the coalition of members pertaining to an individual. I know this is a complex equation, so you can almost disregard this, but on the next page, of course, profit is the purpose of the company, profit making. And let's say that there's a debt D for the company, and the KT is the total intangibles accumulated as well. What would this company do? Of course, unskilled labor will be hired, but skilled, those members who can be skilled up will also be hired so that they can become a core labor force. What matters is not only wages here. The compensation package will be involved. The package is the important part. Those to be hired or employed. CY is the young people's consumption. When young, how much time can be spent for training? How much intensive training was given? Over what time? What skills have been obtained? And when that person gets older, how much consumption that person can make? As viewed from the company, it's not that wages that matters. The package will be given so that the people who will be hired will be conscious about the total package. And of course, half of the package comes in the form of provisioning of training. Next formula shows the profit. Production is involved here. Intangibles, AW, KW for intangibles put into the production, and LW is the unskilled labor, only multiplied by W, wage. So unskilled labor can be hired with just payout of the wages. But people who undergo training and the time will be spent, and 1 minus H will be the portion put into the production. Then this is the labor input. KT portion here is that there is a total intangibles, and part of it, the KW, is used for production. But this KT part, whereas workers undergoing training, the young ones, and it shows the trainer's input. And KT plus 1 is that in the next term, how much accumulation that
どの程度お金を
firm
借りる
can
かっていうのは
make
D
for
プラス1って
intangibles
書い
can
て
be
るやつです
represented
が、
here.
これはそ
D,
の
D plus 1 is the debt that can be
その
borrowed.
経資産から収
For the
益
next
が
term,
RT プラス1だけ上がる
from
んですけれども、そ
intangibles,
のうちの一部は従
the
業員、
production
中
will
核
be
になる従
made,
業
but
員
a
の
part of
そ
it
の給料っていう
will
ことにな
be
りますと、その差がですね、
spent for the
株
wages
主の
for
取り分
core
ということになり
workers,
ます。
and the
で、
remainder will
下
be
から
the
2番目の式はで
shareholders'
すね、
gain.
リクルートしてくる
The
ときに、
second
そ
line from
の若い人
bottom
たち
is
は現在の
upon the
消費の
recruitment,
効用と、それから
young
将来の
people
年取っ
looks
た
at
時の効用、
utility of the
期待効
current
用、
consumption
これがです
and
ね、
also
他の
thinks about the
企業の
expected
条件より
utility
も
when
少なくと
old
も
for
同
the
じか上で
consumption.
ないと、この会社では働かないという。これがその、
And
そのコンペティション
the other one has to be
労働
bigger,
市場
otherwise
で中
people
核
will
に
not
なる人
join
た
the
ちのリクルート
company
の条件にな
because
り
we
ま
are
す。
talking about those young
よ
people who
く
have
若い
potential
人
for
がその
becoming
外
the
資系で
co-workers
働くのの一つの理由
over
は、外資
time.
系で働けば
Young
給料
ones
もいい
tend
かも
to
しれんけれど
prefer
も、
working for a
その
foreign
技能が身に
company
つく。
for higher
それ
wages
がその左側の
and also can get more
身に
skills.
ついた結果、
And on
将
the
来
left hand side,
所得、
as a
消費
result
が
of
増
the
えるという
skills
ことにな
obtained,
ります。で、最
the
後の
future
その
expectations of the
統合ですね。
consumption and
これ
income
が
will go
そ
up.
の
The last equation
もし移ると
shows
ですね、1マイナスセータの
if
分
person
まで
changes
そ
the
の
company, then 1
関
minus
係資産が
theta
失われる
portion
わけですけれども、
up until
そ
the
の
time
ここの
intangibles will
企
be
業に残
lost.
ると
But if you
COZ
stay with a
だけの
company,
収入をもらえる。
the
ですから、
COZ
これがその
income
フロン
will
ト面
be
と60
assured
分、あるいはその中途採
with
用の
a
市場がある
not
から
so
とい
full
ってですね、あん
commitment.
まり給料
And
を
because of
低
the
く
existence
す
of the
るこ
market
と
for
が、
mid-career
特に
recruitment,
成功した人のそのうまくいった人の従業員の給料を低くすることができない。あんまり低くすると他
if
に移
you
ってしまう。
it
そう
doesn't
いう
allow
条件になってい
keeping
ます。
wages low for the
で、均衡はですね、
long
各
tenure workers
企業
or
が
skilled
そういう
workers.
利潤を最大にしていると同時に、労働市場が均衡し
Of
て、
course, each
それか
company
ら
is looking
資
for
産市場も均
maximizing
衡する。
profit
それか
by
ら
looking at
今
the
期の
equilibrium of the labor market and the asset
そ
market.
の
And for the current term,
無形資産の蓄積が来期の KT プラス1を決めている。あるいは今期
KT plus 1 will be
その
determined by the
訓練を受け
accumulated
なかった人たち
intangibles
は
during
来
the
期も
current term.
未
Those
熟
who
練、
haven't
非
received
熟
the
練校
training
として L0T プラス1。
will remain
です
as
から、
a
労働者で
unskilled
も単
worker
純労働の
L0
人っていうの
T
は、
plus
そ
1.
の前の期に
Unskilled
トレーニングを
workers
受けなかったんで、
during the
今期
previous
年取っ
term
た時に
didn't receive any
非熟
training,
練に
so
なると
during
同時
the
に、
current
今
term,
期全
even
く
at
訓
an
練
older
を受け
age,
ないので、
remains to be unskilled.
来期も
And
非
at
熟練
this
のまま
term,
だっていう
no
L0
training is
の
given,
LO
and
の
that
T プラス
person
1なんで、
L0
そういうのが
T plus
ありま
1
す。で、
will
こ
be
の辺
the
は細かいこ
situation
とは
for the
あ
next
まり
term,
気にしな
still
くていいで
remaining
す。
to be
で、そこ
untrained.
でそ
You don't
の
have to
モデル
be
の結果ですね、
conscious
ど
about
う
the
いう
details.
そ
So,
の
but
インプリケー
as
シ
a
ョンになる
result
か。
of this
で、それ
model,
を考えるため
what are
に、
the implications
そ
we can learn?
の中途市場が
Let's think
なか
about
った場合、
this.
セータが1でです
There
ね、
is no
他に移ると
mid-career
全くス
recruitment
キルがなくなっ
market.
てしまう。昔の
Theta
日本
is
の
1.
終身雇用みたいなのを極
In the
端な
olden
例を
days,
挙げて
Japan
考
had
えます。
had a
そうす
lifelong
るとですね、
employment
こういっ
practice, and
た
this is it.
終身雇用制が完璧
And
であっ
this
て、
will
企
look
業の
like
間
this.
を移ること、中途
With
採
full
用が不可能
commitment,
であるような経済を考えると、
and it's
その
impossible to be recruited during the
その
mid-career,
誰がトレーニングされるかというと、それは能力が一定程度
then
以
who
上
will
の
be chosen to be
労働
trained? Those
若
who
い
have
人
a
です。
certain
そし
skill,
て、先ほど
certain
も言いました
potential,
けれども、トレーニング
young
を受け
ones.
た結果、
And
そ
as I said,
の
as a result of having
うま
received
くい
the
ってる人と
training,
うまくいかない人がいるんですけれども、そ
it
れ
works
が
well for
そ
some,
の
not so well
Z×A
for
スター
the
かける
other.
カッパっていう。ですから、これ
The
は
A
何を言ってる
star
かというと、能
multiplied
力が
by kappa.
倍になったらですね、その
If the ability is
先生の
doubled,
教える側の
the
熟
teacher
練の
side or
供給も
trainer
倍
side
になってですね、その結果として得
gives
ら
the
れる
double
熟練
the
が
provision
A
of
スターかけ
training,
るカッ
and
パ
as a result
に
of
なっ
that,
て、で、
A
最終
star
的に得られるの
times
はカッ
kappa
パ、それにかける
the
Z と
workers
いうこ
gained.
とにな
kappa times Z is the skilled workers gained. Last one talks about idiosyncratic shocks. Even these shocks occur, the consumption remains constant. receive the same level of training, then be fortunate or unfortunate,
あります。でこれがまあ言ってみれば高度成長期の
all the idiosyncratic shocks are ensured among skilled members of the same type. This is the sort of extraordinary type which have been experienced during the high economic growth era of Japan. So what we can say here is that look at each individual young worker. Endowment E is very large, and on the vertical axis you can see the learning ability threshold, and if you look at the red line, horizontal one, it shows the full commitment, non-existence of a nuclear recruitment market. So those who have a higher ability will get receiving and with training, and those with a lower ability will not receive training. And those highly potential people will receive more highly intensive training. But then the market has been formed for mid-career recruitment. One can hop the job, and even if you hop the job or stay in a company, there's a limited commitment, LC. You don't lose everything if you switch the company, and this is represented by blue line. So it's not only the ability, but one has to have an endowment as well. Those without endowment, if they receive a half-baked training, it won't work well for that. So people tend to avoid certain types of the jobs because of that. And what happens afterwards as a result of this? So this is the idiosyncratic shock Z. Whether the training resulted in good results or bad results, and training and proportion. Now output is written in dark line, black line, and earnings are in blue line. Skills have not been accumulated lower than blue. One can afford to spend a certain level of consumption and consume. Z star to the 0. But if you look at the higher ones, then Z star, then individual workers' contribution. If wages go way out of the line, then the people will choose to switch the company. Of course, reasonably good wages have to be given to the people who have obtained a certain level of skill. Otherwise, the people will leave the company. This is a picture. This is a numerical example. 0.8% shows that the fraction of positive endowment. 0 to 1. The learning ability in the range of 0 to 1. Distribution U. Share of intangibles is 30%. Share of skills in training, 30% for the teacher, and for the receiver side, 70%. Specificity means here that if one switches the company, how much is lost is about 10%. So if under the full commitment, in terms of skill, highly skilled ones received intensive training, and those who had low potential to start with, they tend to stay as unskilled workers. So I'm here talking about under full commitment. Intangible accumulation would go smoothly. So those without any skill even can get a certain level of wages. inequality is rather small, like in the
社会
case of
に
Sweden.
出てくるわけです。ところが、もしスキルが失わ
However,
れる、他の企業に移ることによって
if
失わ
the
れる量が
skill
10%
is
しかない
lost
場合はです
as a
ね、
result
これが
of
そのインカム
quitting the job of the
所
company,
得が
and
どれ
it
く
will
らい
be
不平
about
等になるか
10%
というのを
loss,
表しておりま
then
し
what
て、
will be
そ
the
の
unequal income that will
そう
be
すると、
produced,
その
unequal
お金
income
が
to be produced?
たくさんない人、ブルーの人ですね、エンダーメ
So
ントが
those
低い人、
in blue,
遺産と
whose
かなんかあんまり
endowment
ない
is
人
low,
は、よっぽど
not
能
much
力がない
inheritance
限
from
り
their parents and so forth,
熟年
then
を
they
受け
have
ら
to
れな
be
い。だいた
very
い
much
87% ぐらいでないと、
about
トレーニン
87%
グが
of
得
the
られない。
people.
それから一方で
This
お
much
金がうん
of
と
the
ある人
potential they
は
have to
そ
have
の
for
能
learning
力が
capability. But in
45% ぐらいでも
case of
海外です
people,
けれども、
even if their
45% ぐらいで
ability is
も普通の
45%,
スキルを得られる。
45% at the level
で
line,
ス
if
キ
their
ルを得
endowment
る
is
トレー
very
ニングの
high, then
そ
they can get
の量もですね、
skill.
その
As
能
for the
力だけ
volume
じゃ
of the
なくてお
training to
金
be
にも依存する。
received, it's
で
not
その
only
結
determined
果得
by
られ
the
る所得っていうのは、これ
ability
が
but
赤
also
い
by
ライ
endowment.
ンのその
This is the
の
resultant
横にぽっちり
income
と
that
下
one
にぽっ
can
ちり
get,
がありま
which
す
is
けれども、
represented in
上
red
のぽっ
line.
ちりの
You
方
can see
が
the top
そ
there.
のトップの
On
10%
the
下の
upper
ぽっちりの
side,
方が
top
ボトムの 10% です
10%,
からが、その
and
ス
the
キル
lower
を
one shows the
トレーニン
bottom
グを受けた人
10%.
で、トレーニングがうまくいかなかった人の
Those who had
総称的
undergone
なそう
training which didn't work out well,
消費
what
は
kind
です
of
ね、その単純
consumption
普通
they
労
will end
働の
up
人よ
with
りもむしろ低い。例えば
compared
大
with
学院に行ったけれども、あ
unskilled
んまりうまく
labor,
いかな
it's
かったっ
low.
ていうのは、そ
Like you
の
went to
所得
university
消
but
費
you
が低
didn't
い
work
可能性
well,
がある。と
work
ころが
out
うまく
well.
いった人って
It
いう
might
の
be
は、
that
す
those
ごく消費が増え
persons
てい
tend
てで
to
すね、ト
remain
ップ
with
の
a low
10%
level
の
of
人は、一
consumption.
番100のところで言
And
うと、
for the top
大
10
体その
percenters,
普通の人
if you
の
look at
7
the
倍から
total
8倍
100,
の所得が得られる。これはトップの
about 7
10%
times
です
or
け
8
ど、
times larger
これ
income can
1% にな
be
るともっとすごい
earned by
所
anyone
得
else.
が得ら
Top
れる。で、こ
10 percenters
れ
will
はな
earn
ぜかというと、
even
成功し
higher
た人
income
は
than
あ
that.
る程度払わない
The reason
と、
is
そ
being
の
that the
切ってしまう
successful
からな
people
んですね。
has to
で、これだけ見ると、その日
can
本
get
のその終身雇用
high
っていうのは
wages,
素晴らし
otherwise
か
that
った。
person will leave that
終身雇
company.
用がその潰れたのは非常にけしからんというようなことになるわけ
And
です
some
が、
people say
実
that it
は
was
終
not
身
good
雇
that
用
the
で日本
lifelong
の雇用で
employment
一
practice
番の
have been
問題は、
lost.
たまたまそ
But there
の
were
相
problems
性が良
with
く
the
なかった
lifelong
会社に入っ
employment
た
as
っていう
well.
のは、その
If
非常に
the
まずい
chemistry
ことに
didn't
なる
work
わけで
well
すね。
between
す
the
ると
individual
結
and the
局採
company,
用が
and
あんまり必要
it
がな
would
いわけ
produce
ですから、
ugly
そこで
results.
ある程度その中途採用の市場が有用な役割も果
Yet
た
one
している
cannot
というような
change
こ
the
とをバラ
company,
ンスよく考
which
え
means
るた
that
めに
the
はですね、その
mid
相性
career
Z っていうの
recruitment
は、
market,
その
if
ト
it
レーニングがどれくらいうまくいったか
exists,
ってい
then
う
it
ん
can
ですけ
serve
れど
the
も、臭いって
utility.
書いた方
You can
は、
see here how well
相性がどれくらい良かっ
Sai
たかってい
here
うのでありまして、
how
で
much
そういうような相性の良
good
さを
match
を
they
考
have.
えると、その相性が非常に悪かった場合、1マイナスセータよりも
If
低
the
かった場合
chemistry
には
didn't
ですね、
work out
これ
well,
は移った方がいいんですね。
lower than
多少
theta,
他の
then
企業
it's
に移って
preferable
セータだ
to
け
change the company
の
and move to a
そ
new
の
firm.
蓄積が失われたとしても、相性はそれより
Theta
悪い
portion
わ
will
けで
be
すから、
lost,
もうちょっといいところで移った方がいい。
but it
そうい
didn't, the
う
matching
そ
didn't
の相
work
性
in
の
the
良
first
さ、
place, so
悪さっ
it
ていう
can
のは
be improved
中
with
途
a
採
new
用では
company.
重要であるわけです。そうするとですね、
So
これは相性がどれくらい重要かによってですね、そのセータ
it's
さっ
really
き
important
他
that
の
the
企
good
業に移
chemistry
る
has
と
to be
トレーニン
produced
グが失わ
between
れるっ
the
て言いましたけれど
people to
も、
be hired
で、
and
そ
the
の
company who
失われ
hires that
る割
person,
合を最後のところで見る
particularly
と
for
です
the
ね、
mid-career
大
recruitment
体
market.
黒で書いたラインを見ると 0.6 とか
If you
7
look
あた
at
り
black
でちょう
line,
どピークに達して、
0.6 or
それ以上のと
0.7,
ころでは
you
マイ
can
ナス
see
になっ
it
ている。
peaks out,
で、これはなぜかという
then
と、
it
移
turns
ると
to
失
the
われるっ
negative.
ていうところではですね、
If you switch the company, something something will be
相性の良さが
lost.
問題になってくるので、セータが
The
あんま
matching
り
didn't
高
work
い
out.
と、かえって良くない。
So if
セ
the
ータが
theta
低
is
すぎ
too
ると今
high,
度は
then
トレー
it's
ニン
not
グが
that
十分
good. But if the theta
企
is
業
too
の側、
low,
労働者の側でトレーニングが十分に受けられないという弊害、我々が
then
強調してい
workers
るのはあるわ
may
け
not
で
be
すが、
able to
あん
get
まり
the full
中途
training.
採用がきつすぎても今度はその相性の 悪さの方が問題になってしまう。で、この辺は、
So even if
実証的な根拠を
exist
持たない
the
と、どれ
well-functioning
どれがどれだ
nuclear
け重要かっていうのは
recruitment
わからないんで
market,
すが、で、その結果で
if
す
the
ね、
chemistry didn't
これ
work out
を
well, then
その
it will
まあ
not
あんまり
produce a good
時間も
results.
ないんで、こっち
I
を
know my
やり
time
ます
is
ね。
running
で
out
これはその
fast, so I have to
スペシフィ
be
シティが
selective to
低
show
くなった。
specificity,
つまり、
which is becoming
10%
low.
他の企業に移ると失われるっていうのをベースラインで考えてま
If
すけど、
10%
それが
shifts the company, then it will be
0.9
lost, this portion,
10% じゃなくて 9%
which is
が減るっ
0.9,
ていう。ですから、
not
中途採
10%,
用の
but
シナリオがある
9%
程度
loss.
良くなったっていう場合を考える。そうすると、
So
その
it shows the
ドッ
improvement
トで
made
書い
in
て
the
るや
market
つ
for
はですね、
mid-career
そのコミットメントが全く問題でない他
recruitment.
の理由で
If you look
コ
at
ミットメン
dotted
トが
line,
問題でない
you
場合
can
を考
see
えるとですね、
the
その成果が
situation
少なく
where
な
a
れば
commitment
移るこ
doesn't
とで
matter.
その能力
Data is
の
low,
その
then one can switch the
能
company,
率が良くなって相
move
性
to
が
a
良
new
くなって
firm,
ですね、で
then
独
efficiency
立
will
も
go
蓄
up
積さ
and
れる
then
し、生産量
matching
も大
will
きくなる
get
っていうこと
better.
が言われますが、
Skills will be
その
accumulated
移
and the
る
total results
中
will
途
get
採用
bigger.
がある結果、みんなが自由に移れるようになって
But
くるとですね、
because
今
of
度は
the
企業の
mid-career
中でその訓
job
練をどうやってや
change
るか、どういう人を訓練するかっていうこ
with
と
a
が
new
問題になって、
company
我々のモデルではですね、
or
そ
the
の
old
結果に
company have
刑
to
が
think about what kind
期
of
待落ち
training
てい
has
く。
to be given to the
期
new
待が
hires,
3、4% 落
and
ち
the
てし
K
まう。
will
生産量も
become lower by 3 or
1%、2%
4,
落ちてしまう。で、それと
and
さらに
production
問題
will
になる
go
のは
down
です
by
ね、
1 or 2%.
どういう人たちのトレーニングが落ちるかというのを見てやるとですね、
So
ケー
what
スタ
kind
ー、
of
これ
people
は
will lose
そ
more
れ以上
training?
ならばトレーニ
Case
ングを得ら
star.
れる。で、その E の L
Going
って
beyond
書い
that,
てある
then
の
one
は
can get more
資
training.
産がない
ENL
人です。割合
written here
貧しい若い
is
人。
that those
これは
without
よっ
any
ぽど
endowment,
その
relatively poor
トレ
young
その能
workers.
力がないとトレーニングが得られない。ところが E
So
の
they
H
have
って
to
書い
be
て
very
あるのはト
capable
レーニング
to
が
receive a training. EH means
その
that
親のとか資産が持ってる。で、セーターが下がる
training
こ
will
と
be
で
given
で
to
す
those
ね、
with a
その
higher
親にどれくらい
endowment.
資産があるかがトレーニングを得られる
So
教
how
育
much
指導に
endowment a parent
影
gives
響して
to
しま
their
う。で、
children
そういった
will
その不平等
make
が
all the
生ま
difference
れ、
in how
し
good
か
a
もそ
job
のトレーニン
children can get.
グの落ち方の度合いはですね、資産を持ってるとあんま
And
り
the
落ちないん
training
だけれ
level
ど
will
も、
go
最
down.
後の
If
右
you
の
have
下
a
の
high
図ですけ
endowment,
れ
the
ども、
training level will
ブル
not
ー
go
の人
down.
た
But
ち、
if you look
あ
at
んまり資産
bottom
を持ってない
side,
人はトレーニングが
blue
非常に
ones,
落ちてし
those
まう。
who are
で、そう
relatively
いう
poor,
ような
training level
問
will
題
go
が
down
発生する。
significantly.
で、
These are the
で、
kind of
その
the
結果、
problems
そ
that
の
will
我
be
々はどういうこと
produced.
が言えたか
And
と
as a
いうと
result
です
of
ね、
this, what can be said
要
here
す
in
るに
terms of
その
conclusion
中途採
is
用の
that,
市場が広がるっていうのは、一方で相性が良い
of course, a
企業に移
mid-career
れるってい
recruitment
う、
market can
そ
get
ういうメ
expanded,
リットはあるんですけれど
which means
も、
that the people
最
can
後
move
にしてで
to
す
new
ね、
company,
その
but there are some
仕事の
impact.
上でのトレーニングが薄くなってしまう。で、企業の側は
Maybe the
トレーニ
on-the-job
ングをして
training
もどっ
might
か
get
行っちゃうだ
weaker.
ろう。だからいうようなこと
Company
を
might
心配して、
expect that
その
even
トレーニング
training
があ
is
んまりし
given
なく
to
な
the
るっていうことに
employees.
なれば、
Employees would leave
で、
their company
そ
anyhow,
の結
so not
果、そ
so much
の
keen to
こうこうい
provide
っ
a
た
good training
そ
to that
の
kind of employee.
経済を考えるとですね、そのまあ、
So
そ
thinking
の
about the economy,
終身雇用が崩れた後の経済を考えるとですね、
talking
能
about
力
the
だけで
economy
はなく
after
て、
the
親の
collapse
資
of a
産もです
lifelong
ね、どん
employment
な
system, not only
職
the
業に就くかってい
ability,
う
but
のに
also
影響す
parents'
る。さらには、
endowment
どの程度トレーニン
would
グを得られ
impact
る
the
ような職種
individual's
に就くかに
job,
も影響する。で、さらには、そ
whether they can
の
get a good job
成
which
功した
comes
か
with a
し
good
ないかによっ
training.
て、どの程度それがその緩
In
和され
terms of
るイン
making
シュアランス
success or the
で、
failure,
そのリスクがシェアできる側にも
invest
影響して
insurance
しまうと
against
いう、そういう副
idiosyncratic
作用を起こしており
risk
ます。で、
has
で、
to
全体で
have
見るとで
also
す
to
ね、
be impacted and affected.
こういったそ
In
の
overall
社
terms,
会ではですね、中途採用が一般化するような社会
in this
で
kind
は、
of
その
society, people can switch
不
jobs
平
at their
等っていうのが
mid-career,
です
which
ね、
is normal.
消費
Then
もしくは所得、両方が
inequality can happen widely in consumption as well as in income. In case of a negative shock, you can have a long trading effect. There are portions I skip. This is the endowment shock. To what extent intangible accumulation gets impacted and the production can get impacted. This is the diagram that I wanted to show you before. There might be a temporary shock which can result in certain result. So there are good parts and the bad parts about the lifelong employment practice. But as a beautiful company, if the skill obtained is not too much company specific, then it can be a general use which allows the employees to switch the company. And it results in companies not so willing to give training to employees. To successful employees, a big wages will be given, but to failed employee, very meager wages will be given, and that's one of the side effects. So there are both lights and shades to these kind of actions. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kiyotaki. At this point in time, I'd like to call upon Professor Hoshi to make a comment as a discussant. Thank you very much. Professor Kiyotaki has been very good at analyzing very difficult problems in economics by capturing the essence by reducing them to a relatively simple model that focuses on only essential parts while eliminating extraneous elements. He has accomplished a lot through this approach. And perhaps this presentation was relatively hard to understand for those who have not studied economics. However, in economics, there are even more complicated models, and even economists like us do not understand what those models mean. However, today, I think very salient feature of Kiyotaki's model, that is to say, relatively easy to understand and a simple model, yet focuses on very essential problems. And there are some equations presented, but it was relatively easy to understand for us. But even though there are some people who may find it more difficult to understand. So for those people, I would like to present to you even simpler version of Kiyotaki's model, streamlined even further without using equations. So let me show you my slides by confirming the main points of Professor Kiyotaki's talk. So the slide is on now. So this is the co-authored by Kiyotaki and Zan's main essence, main message. I think there are two contexts, two situations to compare. First is young people do not change jobs. There is a commitment to that. From the company's perspective, it is very good because they are able to invest in young talents. However, on the right-hand side, there is no commitment for young people to stay in the company because there is a mid-career recruitment market. Therefore, the employees may leave companies. As a result of training, the employees gain high productivity, and such a successful employment have to be retained by companies by providing very good wages. So these are two different situations. So as Kiyotaki mentioned, young people are committed to staying in the same company without mid-career recruitment market. In that sense, depending on abilities, optimum in-company training can be provided. And that level of training does not depend on the endowment or inheritance from their parents. So it is independent. But compared to this, when there are some job hopping opportunities, as I said earlier, in-company training becomes very effective and efficient, and laborers gain productivity. In order to keep these employees, companies have to pay good wages. Therefore, in anticipation of such a situation, companies become more reluctant to provide training. As a result, human capital level will decline, and aggregate output of the companies will decline. This is a problem. Another problem is the in-company training does not depend not only ability, but also on how parents are rich. Therefore, the poor people will not be able to get access to high-level training. Therefore, income inequality or the endowment difference would contribute to even further widening of inequality. So what is written in green here, based on Kiyotaki's model as applied to Japanese economy. So on the left-hand side, this is a commitment situation. As Professor Kiyotaki said, there is a time when we had a lifelong employment. On the right, there is little commitment by employees. That is the situation where lifetime employment system has collapsed. So the collapse of lifetime employment, there is a loss of investment in human capital, and that will result in stagnant economic growth in Japan and a widening income gap. So this is the main part. In addition to this, as he said toward the end, the mismatch between firms and employees can occur, and there is a positive side of changing job in this case. However, in order to simplify the story, I ignored that mismatch possibility. Now, if we apply this to Japanese economy, in essence, lifetime employment system has collapsed, and young people have a more job-changing opportunities. As a result, companies do not want to invest in young workers. As a result, the accumulation of human capital became sluggish. That stagnated the economy. That led to inequality in income distribution. This is a very, very simplified logic. But Japanese economy's problem, very essence of the problems has been explained very simply by this model. It is very convincing. Then what needs to be done? Naturally, Japanese economy is stagnant and income inequality has expanded. This is a bad thing. Then how could we make improvement in this situation? How could we rectify? What is the policy implication of this model? So in order to revive Japanese economy and equalize incomes, what can be done? So Professor Kiyotaki's simple model, as I showed you on this slide, if we take it as face value, the answer is very simple. As Professor Kiyotaki said, the collapse of lifelong employment system is the problem. Therefore, we should reinstate the system and tying young people to the company they originally joined. However, if we consider mismatch, the story is different. However, as Professor Kiyotaki said, maybe this is too simplified, so we have to consider mismatch as well. But yeah, what is important here? What is happening in this model? Is it really happening in Japanese context? To what extent this model is applicable to Japan? In abstract terms, we understand there is an end of lifelong employment, and however, this story is really applicable to Japanese context, the Japanese economy. I think we have to check that first of all. Professor Kiyotaki's and other theorists, rather than those theorists, the researchers like us who are engaged in empirical research have the responsibility for such analysis. if there is a sluggishness in accumulation of human capital, to what extent is it sluggish, and what is it caused by? Is it because companies don't want to train their employees because they don't want to lose employees, or is there any other factor? Or how much contribution that loss of human capital accumulation made to loss of economic growth? Therefore, to what extent economic growth loss has been caused by sluggish accumulation of human capital? That has to be understood. On this point, I am not expert on this issue. However, more recently, we have seen several papers published. For example, through RIETI, the Métis-affiliated research institute called RIETI, Professor Miyagawa Tsutomu of Gakusho University, who Professor Kiyotaki should know very well, and also Professor Takizawa Miho, they wrote an article through RIETI, and they talk about, they surveyed historical situation, and also they provided a very unique analysis. According to this paper, the human capital accumulation through OJT within companies has been declining. That seems to be true. However, what we are talking about now is this is causing a sluggishness in Japanese economy or loss of productivity. So how much is it contributing to loss of productivity, and how much is it caused by increased opportunity to find different jobs? This point has not been clarified yet, so we have to increase empirical research on this topic. I think this is the area of responsibility of us empirical researchers. Now, suppose that the stagnant human capital accumulation did slow down the Japanese economy. Suppose that is the case. How significant is that as a cause of slowdown of Japanese economy? Because there are other factors mentioned as a cause of slowdown of Japanese economy. So the sluggishness in human capital accumulation, how responsible is it to the slowdown of Japanese economy? In terms of the causes of Japanese economic slowdown, there are many cited. For example, the decline in labor population and lack of progress in IT investment, particularly in SMEs. And also, my theory is that low productivity firms stay in the market, preventing new and more productive firms from entering or expanding. This is called a so-called zombie company problem. This can be a cause as well. So compared to these other factors, how important was the sluggish growth of human capital investment? By considering these things, I think we can understand how much priority needs to be given to certain policies. Now, because of the sluggishness of human capital accumulation, that is not only causing labor productivity decline, but also widening income gap. So this has to be considered as well. I have another slide. This is the level of income inequality in terms of Gini coefficient. And when everybody has the same level of wages, the Gini coefficient is 0. And if one person grabs all the wealth, then Gini coefficient is 1. Therefore, the higher the coefficient is, the greater the inequality. From 1990 to 2017, Japan's Gini coefficient is plotted here based on the national government statistics. So red line, as you can see, this is the initial income indicator. And if you look at that, level of income inequality has been rising. As a result, as Professor Kiyotaki's paper stressed, such an increase of widening income gap is rising. And Professor Miyagawa and Professor Kiyotaki, the sluggishness of human capital accumulation can be considered as well. And the level of income inequality has been changing. And the relationship between the two can be explained by this paper. And I think this is very pertinent to the Japanese economy. Having said that, although this model does not incorporate the following, actually, after income is distributed to workers, it is usually redistributed by the government in the form of taxes or other means. So what is the distribution after redistribution? So redistributed income Gini coefficient is indicated by blue line. If you look at that, from 1990s, Gini coefficient of Japan, the income inequality, as far as redistributed income is concerned, the Gini coefficient remains constant relatively. So as this paper says, the in-company training has been declining, human capital accumulation has become sluggish. As a result, inequality level has actually risen, perhaps. However, because of the redistribution by the system has been quite effective, therefore, the inequality level after redistribution has not changed very much. Many people say that Japan has become more unequal society. However, I don't think such an inequality is not that significant problem. It is not. Productivity decline, productivity sluggishness would be even more serious problem in my view. And human capital accumulation sluggishness, how is it related to this issue? And to solve the issue, what kind of policy can be recommended is something we have to consider going forward. Lastly, I have a quite detailed technical model related question. In this model, the skills increase thanks to incoming training. However, the company-specific skills and general-purpose skills. So the ratio of company-specific skills to general-purpose skills is constant. That is assumption. Theta is what was used. And how much skill is lost when the employee moves from one company to another. And this ratio remains constant. That means it is assumed that through training, both types of human capital are accumulated in the same way, namely human capital in company-specific and general purpose skills. However, I think it is possible to be trained with only in-company specific skills or acquire only generic skills. So by making a choice between the two, the level of company specificity can be chosen by firm or by workers. Therefore, in that direction, models can be expanded. Perhaps Professor Kiyotaki has done so already. But if we consider such a generalized model, I think the result may be different, which would be quite interesting. This concludes my comment. We would like to entertain questions from the audience. I hand over to Professor Aoki for question and answer session. Thank you very much. Professor Kiyotaki, would you like to respond to Professor Hoshi's comments?
Thank you very much, Professor Hoshi. I almost agree with everything you have mentioned. For one thing, the last part, depending on the work or the training pattern or type of the job, there are company-specific skills or more general type of skill, and perhaps one can make a selection. I agree that there is an aspect to it that we haven't yet researched in this area, so I don't know what will be the results, honestly speaking, at this time. However, for many of the skills, some of it might be company specific, but most of the skills can be applicable to new firm or company that people will switch their job to. So there is certain applicability here.
Thank you very much. We would like to start Q&A session. We would like to entertain questions from the floor. We have already received many questions already. We don't think we'll be able to take up all the questions. I apologize in advance. Now, there are some common themes in some questions. So from my part, I would like to summarize those questions in my own words to ask you questions. One is Professor Hoshi's question. This is related to Professor Hoshi's question as well. The company-specific skills and generic skills. There are two types, and I think there could be a different ratio throughout the times. And I think generic skills are more prevalent compared to company-specific skills. If that is the case, what would be this model's implication? This is the first question.
Yes, thank you. What you said is correct. There are generic skills out there. Most of it is a generic. In citing the numerical examples, 90% of the skills can be applicable elsewhere. So 10% will be the lost portion, which is company specific. Conditions are changing, so 10% going down to 9%, which means that generic skills accounts now for 91% instead of 90. It doesn't look much, but what we are doing is centering around the situation where generic skills are in majority. Just recently, level of skills are becoming much more generic than before, and I agree with what you had mentioned.
Thank you very much. Another question. This came from multiple participants. The United States. There are countries where lifelong employment system. However, there are countries where human capital investment is quite active. What is your view about these countries?
Thank you for the question. So be it the Japanese case or American case, one has to be willing to gain more skills themselves even before finding a job. One has to be mindful of getting the training and skills. The first kappa means the individual workers' differences in ability. However, even before joining the labor market, one may go to the school or go to the business schools and get the skills. Be it in Japan or in the United States, particularly in the United States, most of people do that. So those are people who can afford to go to business schools and who cannot. That depends on the initial endowment of that particular individual. And also recent trend goes that even before finding a job, it takes a long time. Before becoming a physician or lawyer or scholars like ourselves, before you become a full-fledged professional in that specific area, it takes a long time. So after graduating from the university, it takes 7 years or 10 years. before becoming a full-fledged professional. And you have to support yourself during the meantime and be able to support the family, which means that initial endowment means very much, makes all the difference. The professors that I mentioned, like lawyers and the scholars, you do not know whether you can be successful after having received the training. And one might be hesitant in going ahead with that kind of profession.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next question. Again, this came from multiple participants. The question is about the model. In company training, on the job training, the first asset of young employees, how effective is that?
All right, why the initial endowment is so important? Because one needs time before becoming a full-fledged professional. So if you find a job like becoming a scholar, for example, it's good to become a scholar, but one is not guaranteed with the success. It's quite dangerous. It takes 10 years before becoming a full-fledged scholars, for example. So people may not even care to choose that kind of profession in the first place, and initial endowment from the parents makes all the difference, even for the journalists and so forth. Sometimes some kind of the profession will require people to work free of charge for a long time, so one must be able to afford that kind of life, which means that one needs a good endowment. So the inheritance from parents might be a big thing.
Thank you. Again, there are questions from multiple participants. Please see recommendation, namely based on your model. For example, those capital shortage people, maybe subsidies can be provided to such poor people. What kind of role can government play?
Yes. What is the government's role? To change the initial condition, the kappa portion, for joining the labor market, what kind of skills one can gain, and the minimum level of skills have to be made possible to be gained by people, and that's where government assistance can come in. The ability with which to join the labor market is kept outside of the realm, so to speak. Basic education, specifically, and the schooling education must be strengthened so that when one joins the labor market, having acquired a certain level of learning capability, one can join the labor market, and that level has to be elevated, which is a good way to narrow the inequality or the gap. That's how I think. And afterwards, what could happen? It depends on the company. Some companies are keen to give a OJT training very much, and some companies are not that keen. Not only wages, but in terms of the giving of the training, companies can make a difference. So that can be a good recruitment tactic. I only compared 2 points in time, but another study is showing the depreciation rate of the skill and so forth, like 30 to 40% per year. 30% means on per year basis. If you remain idle, then it will get reduced down to 70%, or 2-year period, it's reduced to half. And furthermore years, then it will get down to 1/4. So continuous training is important, not only in schooling education, but in companies as well. Continued training is very important. I didn't emphasize that much in my lecture today, but IT is not progressing well in Japan yet. because there is a shortage of manpower who can support IT upskilling. So we have equipment for IT, but not many people to teach how to use it. So this is a part about the investment in human
ありがとう
capital.
ございます。まだ、また
Thank
よろ
you
しいで
very
すかね。
much.
これはその日
Uh,
本の少
we
子高
still
齢化
have
に
some
関す
time,
る
right?
質問
This is about Japan's situation where the aging progresses and with declining population. If we use the model, the number of young people
どんどんこう縮小していくような
compared
状態
to mid-career
この
people
モデル
is
考えると
declining, shrinking in such an economy. What is this model's implication in such a society?
あんまりやって
Well,
ない
I'm about to work on
で
it.
すね。ですから、
Not much
その
research
ど
done
んな
yet.
結果になるかっていうのは、あんまりまだはっきりしたことは言えないんですけ
So
れ
I
ど
do
も、
not
やっぱ
know
り
in advance what
若い
kind of
人が
results
減る
this
って
kind
い
of
うこ
research
と
can
で、
yield.
そのスキ
There's a
ルを
reducing
得た
number
結
of
果、
young
そ
people.
のどれくらいリターンがある
So
かっ
after
ていうのは、
getting the
将来
skill,
どの程度労
how
働
much
力がある
return
か
one can
です
get.
から、その無形
It
資
all
産
depends
と
on
労
the
働っていうの
availability
は
of the
分かれて
labor
るんじゃない
for
かと思うんですね。
intangibles and labor.
で、
Those are
そういう意味では
complementary
そ
to each
の労
other.
働が縮小するっていうの
So
は
in this
無
sense,
形資産を
if
蓄
the
積す
labor
る
market
ことに
shrinks,
はマイナスになると思いま
then
す。
it would
た
work
だ、受ける側
negatively
か
for
ら
the
すると
accumulation of
教える人がいっぱいいる
intangibles.
ってい
But
う
on the
ので、
receiving end,
その
there are so many trainers
そ
who are
の
willing to
年
teach
取っ
them
た
the
そ
skill.
のこれから人口が減るっていうんで、インセンティブが減るわけです
So
けど、実
in
際
view
に
of
減
the
った後で
declining
は先
population,
生の方が
incentive
多
will
いってい
get
うの
lesser,
で、
but after it has
ま
been
あ、
reduced,
そ
then
の
it will
教えてもらえる
people
方
would
がい
end
っ
up
ぱい
with
あ
a
る。
situation where there are a larger number
た
of
だ、
teachers available
IT
who
とか
can
なんと
teach
か
you
ってい
many
うのは、
things.
年
But
寄
when
り
it comes
が若い
to
人を教えるっていうのはある
IT,
んですけど、一方で若い
the
人の方が
elderly
年寄
can
りを教える
teach
っていうの
young,
は
but
ありましてですね。
much more than
で、
that, the younger
そう
people
いう意
can
味で
teach
は、
elderly
両方
more.
教え合うようなのが、
It
も
goes
うちょっと
two-way.
豊かなモデ
It's
ルでは
mutual.
重要になってくるというふうに思ってます。
That will
あ
become
り
an
がとうござい
important
ます。
element in the future
さら
model,
に
I
で
would
す
say.
ね、
Thank you
こ
very
の
much.
その先生の
Furthermore,
ご講演では、人的資本への
in
トレー
your
ニング、その
lecture,
先生のトレーニ
human
ングの
capital
停
related
滞な
training,
どに焦点を
so
当てたかと
training
思うんですけど
uh,
も、
has been
それは
stagnant,
他の
and that was
経
a
済
focus
投資
in your
について
lecture.
もその停
However,
滞しているような
other
ところもありますが、それ
intangibles
についてどのように
investment
考えていらっ
seems
しゃいますか。
to be lagging behind in
IT と
terms of
か
investment.
そ
What
う
is your
い
view about that?
うのも無形投資、あるい
With
は
regard to
最近だと
R&D
その
and other
その
intangibles,
研究開発だけではなくて、もうちょっとブランドだ
not
とか
only
ですね、その手の
R&D, but
いろんな
branding
形の無形資産の投資、
and many other forms and
それは
shapes
や
of
っぱり
intangibles.
重要だと
Everything is involved,
思います。で、
and
それに関
investment
して
in
そ
any
の
form of
停滞し
intangibles
て
are
るんで
very
はないか
important.
っていうのは、一つ
And
はやっ
questioner
ぱり
said
そ
the
の
situation might be
R&D とか
stagnated
ですね、ブランドにしても、やっぱり人が
in
いな
terms
い
of
とダ
branding and
メなんで、
R&D.
人の
We
部
do
分
need
が
the
やはり大きい
rich
んではないかって、
resources of
ですから
human being,
そ
human
の
capital.
決してその、なんていうか、代替的ではなくて、むしろ人との投資と
It's
か、
not
その
replaceable.
研究開発投資っていうのは、両方とも
That is
補
why
完的な
investment
部
has to
分
come in
があるんでは
in
ないか
human
と
capital
私
as
は思
well
い
as
ます。
in R&D. They are
あり
complementary.
がとうございます。でですね、
Thank you
もう
very
一つ
much.
ぐらい大丈夫だと思うんですけども、
Perhaps we can
ちょ
take
っと
up
これ
one
少
more
し大き
question.
な、
はい。
This
モデ
is
ル
more
を
broad.
た部分がある質問だと思うんですが、
A
日
question
本におい
separate
て
from the
は
model per
終身
se.
雇用の
In Japan,
終焉、も
lifetime
しくは成長率の均衡とか、
employment
あ
system has
と、
ended,
金融市場の変化と
people
か、大
say,
き
and
な変化
also
が
there
同
is a
時に起こっ
change
たよ
in
うな
financial market,
感じ
and
が
the
受けられるん
major
ですけど
shifts
も、
are
その
occurring
経
at the
済
same
構造が
time.
大きく変わったとき
Then
に、
why is
その
it
終
that
身雇用が
when
増
economic
えている
structure
かというふう
significantly
にお考えです
changes,
か。
それ
do
は
you think why the
やっぱり
lifetime employment
答
system
えが
collapsed?
見つかり、終身
I
雇用が
cannot give a
そ
good
のおそら
answer.
くその直接的なきっかけはですね、90年代の後半
Why
に
the lifelong
米
employment
国
practice had
景気
ended
が非常に悪化した
toward
時
the
に、
second half of the 1990s.
最
The
初
financial
の
crisis had
うちは
worsened
その
very
新
much.
規雇用を削るっていう
Initially,
形で起こってたのが、
company
最後は
reduced
そ
new
の
hires,
既存の
but in the
そ
end,
のコアなる労働者にも早期退職とかを認めるっていうような
early retirement have been recommended for core employees as well. I think that has been the situation. So there were existent core employees who are recommended with early retirement. And on top of that, new hires have been reduced and cut down. And those two things had worked to reduce the lifelong employment practice. That's how I see it. If you cut down the new hires, then they cannot transform themselves to the would-be trainers in the end. Initially, it looks as a reduction of cost, but over the longer years, you lose the people who can be trainers. For example, in university situation as well, if you stop new hires, then initially you would think that there is no impact. But over a passage of a certain period of time, we will see that there is no more vitality and so forth. You know it over time. So initial trigger was the financial crisis, but it resulted in the stagnation of hiring new people and also recommending early retirement for the core employees, and the mid-career recruitment market had also expanded, which ushered in the stagnation.
Thank you very much. We received many questions from the audience, but we were not able to entertain all the questions due to the paucity of time, but the time has come. But anyway, thank you very much for responding to many questions, Professor Kiyotaki. Thank you very much. This concludes the lecture session by Professor Kiyotaki. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.